Good evening, everyone. I hope you're all enjoying your meal. We're about to start the program. Before we begin tonight's remarks from Congressman Randy Fine, renowned author Melanie Phillips, and Middle East Forum founder and chairman Daniel Pipes, I was hoping to share a few items with you of import regarding tomorrow's Hill Day and also an upcoming event that I really think all of you should join. First, next Thursday, May 29th at 11:30 a.m. on our new MEF Roundtable, hosted by Lori Regan, our board member from New York, we'll have the new CEO of the David Horowitz Freedom Center, Daniel Greenfeld, Sam Westrop from Islamist Watch, and Frank Gaffney, speaking about stealth jihad and Islamism in the West. A fascinating subject. We didn't really touch on it too much today, so let's consider it a postscript to this conference. 11:30 a.m. on Zoom. Anaf, right here, will be sending out the invite next Sunday probably. And that'll be in addition to our normally scheduled programming and podcasts. The second item is, sometime this summer, Alex Selsky, where are you? Alex will be, I think I can officially say this now, but launching the Iran Freedom Caucus in the Knesset with multiple Iran opposition leaders addressing members of the Knesset, citizens of the State of Israel, and potentially in a future iteration, members of Congress. Going back to our Israel Victory Caucus we had 10 years ago with then Congressman DeSantis, now Governor DeSantis and others. And while we don't have a specific date, my understanding is it'll probably be in the second half of July. So if you find yourself in Jerusalem sometime in the second half of July of this year and you want to attend an event at the Knesset, we'd love to have you join us. And we'll get Olam Yerushalayim so we can get 250, 300 people. So those are my two announcements. The last one is that, and then I'll speak about this also before the evening ends. Liron, where are you? Liron is running our Congressional Advocacy Day tomorrow. And we have very specific instructions that I've been asked to give, which I have here, that I will read between the speakers. And I will impart them upon you regarding our checkout and visit to Capitol Hill in a little bit. But enough with what I have to say, and the real reason why you're here, what you all have come to hear from Congressman Fine, Melanie Phillips, and Daniel Pipes. I am honored to introduce Melanie Phillips, who will be discussing how Islamism uses war against the Jews to destroy Britain and the West. Melanie is a distinguished British journalist, broadcaster, and author who has spent over 3 decades defending traditional values and exposing the cultural forces eroding Western civilization. She writes weekly for the Times of London and the Jewish News Syndicate, appears regularly in broadcast media, and speaks widely across the English-speaking world. Her latest book, The Builder's Stone: How Jews and Christians Built the West and Why Only They Can Save It, has been praised as both fearless and invaluable. Writing in The Spectator, William Shawcross called it a powerful reminder that the West needs to trust in its roots to defeat these new Nazis, and commended Melanie for her clarity and courage in the face of rising anti-Semitism and moral confusion. Please join me in welcoming Melanie Phillips.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here. I have admired the MEF for a long time and have learned a great deal from it, and I'm learning a great deal from this great conference. Now, I'm sure I don't need to tell you that we're meeting in times of unprecedented peril and concern. The October 7th, 2023 atrocities in Israel threw down a challenge to the West. Do you support civilization or barbarism? And I'm afraid to say that it has not chosen civilization. And I would suggest to you that the reason it has not chosen civilization is that the West no longer understands what civilization is. and it no longer understands that the West invented it. I don't believe it's simply a matter of Western civilization. I believe that we're talking about civilized values themselves. What we've been living through since October the 7th is not just a mortal threat to Israel's survival, it's also an existential threat to the West and the war against civilization itself. It's astounding that in the reaction to these appalling, depraved atrocities of October the 7th and the war that has followed, in which Israel has sought to defend itself against overtly threatened genocide, it has found itself the victim of a campaign waged against it by the West, which has painted the most just war conceivable into aggression and war crimes by the Israeli victims of war crimes, aggression and depravity. The way that the West has accepted patently ludicrous falsehoods as true has been unhinged. We have witnessed a total collapse of reason and rationality. Evidence is dismissed. Facts no longer have traction. This kind of double standards, demonization, and systematic lying is applied to no other people, nation, or cause on earth. It is a level of obsession and hysteria which suggests that we're witnessing a pathology at work. Indeed, just today, talking of pathology and how this is actually embraced by countries of the West, we have seen the United Kingdom, France, and Canada threatening sanctions against Israel and drawing praise from Hamas for throwing it a lifeline, just as Israel, by an amazing coincidence, nears destroying Hamas, and just as the Gazans, for the second day running, have been demonstrating against Hamas. I'm afraid to say that my birth country, the United Kingdom, along with Canada and France, must now be perceived to be the allies of Hamas against civilization. These countries and others in the West cannot see that the war being waged against Israel is an Islamic holy war against first Israel and then the West. They can't see it because they can't see the Islamic threat to itself in the West. They can't see the steady advance of Islamization of Western nations through both the democratic process, which is being subverted, as well as threats and intimidation. In Britain, you may be surprised to learn, it is an accepted official view that Islamic extremism has got nothing to do with Islam. The real problem in Britain, we're told, is the far right. That is a problem, it's increasing, but here's the thing. Official figures suggest that the Muslim community in Britain is about 6% of the population, and according to MI5, the security service, among the people that they're most frightened about, the people that they're trying to keep tabs on but are too numerous for them to watch, 90% are Muslim. 6% of the population are 90% of the most mortal threat. But of course, it's got nothing to do with Islam. Britain has systematically, for decades, and I've written about it for a long time, ignored the evidence of Islamization. A couple of brief examples that I will just briefly mention. There was what was called the Trojan horse plot, in which Muslims on governing councils of schools in the city of Birmingham waged a campaign of attrition against head teachers and teachers in order to Islamize the classrooms, in order to Islamize the syllabus. There was an official inquiry presided over by the former head of counter-terrorism for the Metropolitan Police. He found many serious concerns about this. He made many recommendations. He said this is not just happening in Birmingham, it's almost certainly happening in schools up and down the country. The government must take action. The government ignored everything he said. You will also have heard about the so-called rape and grooming gangs, rape and pimping gangs, which have enslaved, tortured, abused, raped, and in one or two cases murdered thousands of young white girls, mainly from the wrong side of the tracks. This, unlike what you've been told, has not been a secret. It was kept secret for about 10 years because the police and welfare authorities would not move against these men because they were mainly of Pakistani Muslim heritage. They were frightened of being called racist. They did move against them. There have been dozens and dozens of these men who have been convicted in court and jailed, but it's still going on, and successive governments have refused to even hold proper inquiries into it. So that's a kind of very small set of examples of how they are not facing up to what they are actually confronting. In Europe, you can see it is losing its cultural identity through mass immigration, particularly of Muslims who refuse to integrate. Many Muslims in Britain and in Europe are no problem. They do integrate, and we must not lose sight of that. But there are huge numbers who refuse to integrate and expect Western cultures to adapt to Islam instead. So, why does the West refuse to acknowledge this mortal threat to itself? Well, the first example is fear. The numbers now are too large, the threats of violence are too explicit, and are backed by actual instances of terrorism. But there's something much more deep and insidious going on. The West has told itself for decades that it is racist to think that people from the developing world can do any wrong at all. The default position of the Western liberal is that people from the developing world are oppressed by the West, they are victims. As victims, they can do no wrong, while the West, being their oppressors, can do nothing right. And here's the thing, the state of Israel is considered one of the oppressors. Under this ideology, Jews can never be victims because everybody knows, don't they, that the Jews control everything. They control finance, they control the law, they control the media, they control industry, they control the American government, which is a mere puppet in their hands. So at the core of the liberal position, the default liberal position in the West, at the core of this liberal position is deep, deep-dyed anti-Semitism. So the West is ignoring these threats to itself, and it is instead blaming Israel for defending itself against the very same threat. We've all gone through the looking glass. How could this have happened? Well, it's a long story. I've written about it in my book, The Builder's Stone, and I'll try to encapsulate it as briefly as I can. For decades, the West has told itself it was born in the original sins of colonialism and imperialism. For decades, Western elites have been attacking its core precepts and institutions. The problem it identified was particularity. The West had a particular culture. The Western nation had a particular culture and particular traditions. And the nation was therefore itself the source of division, prejudice, and war. What was preferable was a kind of brotherhood of man template, or otherwise known as universalism. The West told itself that universalism, the brotherhood of man, represented all good things, making a better world, producing freedom and justice. But of course, universalist ideals are not universalist at all. The kind of ideals that we all think of as civilized are deeply particular to the West. And ultimately, they come from biblical values at the core of Western civilization. The core, the fundamental creed of the West is Christianity, but Christianity rests upon Judaism. And the core values of the West are fundamentally Jewish values. Few realize quite how important Jewish values have been to making the West civilized and great. It's not just what we all know of as, the moral settlement, personal responsibility, respect for every human being, because they're made in the image of God. We kind of all know that kind of thing, but it's amazing to realize that core principles that were fundamental to the development of political freedom and democracy in the West, which were revolutionary when the ancient Israelites invented them, are core to the West. Two examples. One is limited government, the idea that the ruler, the king, is not the absolute ruler. The absolute ruler is God Almighty, and the kings of ancient Israel were bounded by judges and prophets. Okay, some of them were tyrants, but the template was limited government, which was revolutionary at the time. You could not be, in an ideal world, a tyrant. Even more revolutionary, in my view, was the ideal of the law, that is, the rules by which people are governed, having to be founded in the consent of the people. When Moses came down the mountain with the law, he said to the people, "What do you think, guys?" And they all said, "Yeah, we'll do that." That was revolutionary. And when it came to the 18th century, to pass lightly on a few hundred years, people who were evangelical Christians of the time in Britain drew specifically on those principles in the Hebrew Bible to form what became Britain's constitutional monarchy, in which Parliament, resting on the consent of the people to laws passed in their name, would be superior in authority to the monarch and to the church. Revolutionary ideal. Parliamentary democracy, political freedom drew from that, and those same kinds of people came here and founded your constitution, and your founding fathers wrote tracts and pamphlets and books, just like the ones in Britain, which are peppered with specific references to the Hebrew Bible as being the foundations of political freedom. So, fundamental to all this was what is key, I think, to the West in general. Fundamental was the Jews' sense of themselves as a people, as a nation, not just a country, but a self-conscious unit characterized by a strong sense of a shared culture, purpose, and traditions, and crucially by equality of civil status. Now, all that is now in jeopardy. The onslaught on the Western nation and on Western values means that society is increasingly no longer a shared project, but is disintegrating into the warring tribes of victim groups and identity politics. And of course, Israel is the quintessential nation state. The Jews basically invented the nation state, and the Jews are the most particularist of peoples, the most apart of all peoples. And therefore it's hardly surprising that in a society which has taken an axe to its own core values, that the Jewish people and the state of Israel have a bullseye on their backs. The unprecedented onslaught against the Jews has occurred because the Jews are central to Western civilization. They are civilizationals, they are Western civilization's soul. And this is a society against which the West has itself venomously turned. October the 7th, I would suggest, turbocharged the West's decades-long process of cultural suicide. Now, the Islamists understood this far, far better about the West than the West has understood it about itself, because the Islamists understand that religion is the moral scaffolding of a culture. Without that scaffolding, a culture collapses. And the Islamists understood that when it came to the West, the Jewish people were the scaffolding of Western civilization. It's why they say in terms that their aim is first to destroy Israel and the Jews as a precursor to coming for the Christians and destroying the West. From the early 20th century, the Islamic theorist Sayyid Qutb, who inspired modern political Islam and reawakened Islamic holy war against the non-Islamic world, from him to Osama bin Laden, from him to the Hamas Charter, Islamic jihadis have always said their war is against modernity, which is a kind of bacillus carried by the West, and behind both modernity and the West are the Jews. So the West's onslaught against itself and its core values and institutions created, as we've heard today, a cultural vacuum. The Islamists saw their chance. They understood the point about a cultural vacuum. Because a cultural vacuum, there is no national identity that anyone even understands, let alone wants to defend. And they saw their chance and seized it, which is why we have the eruption into the Western world of the Muslim Brotherhood, with Hamas as its terrorist wing. You had here the Holy Land trial, where there were documents that were discovered that laid out very clearly the Muslim Brotherhood's aims of the democratic subversion of violence and of having lots and lots of babies, which are being carried out to the letter, and nobody mentions it apart from people like yourselves. And I would suggest that there was a further step that needed to be taken and was taken, because the ground for the Islamists had been laid from the 1960s onwards by the cause of Palestine. Palestinianism is the Islamist Trojan horse, because the Palestine cause has become the default position for all Western progressives. It's come on the back of colonialism, as you will know. Israel is seen as a colonialist enterprise. This is crazy. The truth is that the Jews are the indigenous people of the land, and it's the Arab and Muslim world that are the colonizers, and Zionism is the great project of decolonization. But facts cannot dent this narrative that the Palestinians are the indigenous people of the land, the Palestine cause is the cause of the oppressed, because, of course, in this post-biblical world, there is no such thing as truth. The idea of objective truth, it is said, is only believed by people who are unsophisticated and uneducated. But if there is no such thing as truth, then there are no such things as lies. So lies become unchallengeable, because in this post-truth world, everything is a matter of opinion, and feelings trump facts. So progressives which sign up to all of this think of themselves as moral. They're progressives because they're moral. They're moral because they're progressives. They support the oppressed as a moral act. They're supporting the oppressed Palestinians as a badge of their moral worth. And under the doctrine of intersectionality, Jews are oppressors because, as I said, everyone knows in this world that they run everything. So the Palestine cause has become a badge of personal moral worth for the entire liberal world. Because the cause is supposedly moral and the Palestinian people are victims, the liberal world has bought entirely into the narrative of falsehoods and lies. More than that, it has supported, the liberal progressive world is supporting, by supporting the Palestinian cause, it is supporting a project of extermination, the extermination of the State of Israel, and more than that, it is supporting a cause which steals the Jews' own history in the land. The Palestinian cause is the ultimate cultural appropriation. And this, while Palestinian cause supporters are also buying into the language of the Palestinian cause, which is the language of medieval anti-Semitism and Nazi anti-Semitism with imagery of rats, octopuses, and other stuff like that. This is coming out of the mouths of progressive people today about the State of Israel today. So this terrible thing is this, that if you're a progressive person, and you believe that supporting Palestine is a badge of moral worth, you believe that the Israelis are colonizers, and therefore they're really evil people, it follows from that anti-Semitism becomes obligatory. You have to hate the Jews because they're really bad people. That is the terrible thing that we're seeing. That is why we're seeing all this moral virtue signaling around crazily the language of extermination and Nazi ideology, because this is the logic. Anti-Semitism becomes morally mandatory. And so, with all these terrible perversions and inversions and madnesses, I'm afraid the Palestinian cause has recruited the Western intelligentsia, and it's recruited many Western governments. All of them subscribe to the religion of universalism, because the brotherhood of man means that the transnational superstructure of human rights law, of international courts, of the NGOs like Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, all of which are actually, because they represent the world, they're actually dominated by rogue states and tyrannies and kleptocracies, all of which are mortal enemies of Israel and mortal enemies of freedom and democracy. Through the Palestinian cause, the institutions of the entire humanitarian establishment, whose every word is regarded as unchallengeable by Western governments, the institutions of the humanitarian establishment have been turned into a weapon of exterminatory war against Israel. In Britain, across great swathes of the professions, the administrative class, and of course the intellectual class, everybody believes that Israel is guilty of crimes of which it is not only innocent, but is the victim of those being lauded by the West as its conscience. And we have this extraordinary situation, therefore, in which Islamists and Western liberals are marching on the streets side by side in what's called the Red-Green Alliance, which is, to put it mildly, ironic, since the people who are marching as, for example, Queers for Palestine, alongside Islamists, have absolutely no idea that those Islamists, if their chosen society comes to pass, would take their heads off their shoulders. They are united by a desire to end the West and by mutual detestation of Israel and the Jewish people. Now, my book goes into this in great detail, and it sounds awful, it sounds as if it's all over. On the contrary, I don't think it's all over at all. I think the West can survive. I think it is an open question whether it wants to survive, but if it wants to survive, it can do so, provided it does certain things. I think that the Jewish people who do cultural survival as their unique selling point can help the West pull back from the cultural brink because they know how to keep the cultural show on the road. My final remark is this. The West is facing an Islamist death cult. It's a death cult because they say, we love death, you love life, we will win. And it's a death cult because they want to destroy the West. The West is paralyzed in the face of this Islamist death cult because the West is itself gripped by a cultural death wish. It seems not to want to live. If the West is to survive, it has to learn to love itself enough to want to live. And it has to learn to love the Jewish people, whose great lesson for the world is how to keep the cultural show on the road. That's because Israel does love itself. It loves what it stands for and it wants to live. The secret weapon that Judaism offers the West at this parlous point is just two words: choose life. Israel will therefore survive and thrive, the West may not. Much of the Arab world has come to understand this. Now it's time, I would suggest, for the West to understand it too. Thank you very much.